Hi, greetings. My name's Jonathan Wetham. I'm one of the committee members for Colchester Pagan Network, um, and involved in sort of getting everything together for Leaping Hare, although it's often the others who are far more do the heavy lifting. But I was just asked to come up with a little talk while we all can't get together currently as we ordinarily would. So hopefully this is just something to keep us not so much distracted, but just that opportunity to give something to ourselves to stop and think away from the news or social media, all the conjecture, but also remembering all the fantastic things people are doing in their communities. There's been times of sheer selfishness and worry, which you can understand, but also great sacrifice, and people really coming together for their neighbours, those who are vulnerable, those who really need people's help. So I have to apologise, this is probably rather more unscripted and unstructured than I would ordinarily give, in part just in terms of time, in part because I have a 2.5-year-old, so at any minute it may be like that news clip where there's I think it's an ambassador in the States, and the little toddler comes charging in while the nanny tries to grab them and get them out of picture. If so, she might have something more to contribute than I do. So that's just that sort of caveat. Now, what I've been really trying to think about is what to actually talk about in a meaningful way in the current times. That doesn't sound superficial in terms of sort of the big issues that are affecting the world at the moment. But that's magic. There's trials that we all have to face. And perhaps it's not just the trials as we as individuals on our own paths, but as the whole planet, the whole planetary being of all faiths, creeds, and none. This is affecting everyone. So by training, I'm both a magician and a philosopher. I'm sort of have written in the past on philosophy of religion, existentialism, even artificial intelligence, amongst other things, and then jumping to Western mystery tradition, Kabbalah, King Arthur, etc. It's quite a broad range of different things. So I'm going to try and combine all those together in a sort of short talk, hopefully. So we'll see how we go. Again, it's mainly just meant to spark thoughts and interests and maybe avenues to explore while we're all at home during this time. And hopefully the sun is rising soon on the horizon after all of this. So to start with, all my thoughts are with you all, and many blessings. Let's get on with it. So King Arthur keeps coming back to my mind. It's a figure, an archetype, a legend, maybe a historical figure that I've come back to time and time again in different ways, whether it be through the writings of Dion Fortune, John, Caitlin, Matthews, for example, or whether through bars and druids like Christopher Hughes, etc. It's something that's always perplexed me, is this king, someone who we're promised will rise again, and when Britain is in its greatest need, where he and his knights will ride forth and save Britain. But all the legends and things, the movies we read, he's often a failed king in many ways. It's his knights are the ones that do the work. They're off on the quests and he's the one who sits on his throne in his hall by his warm fire with a roasting boar, drinking some of his mead, maybe prepared by Mike, for example. And he's often seen as sort of a failed king. His greatest knight, Sir Lancelot, and his beloved wife betray him. He's seen as having been wounded in battle and was only really revived after he was given a drink from the Holy Graal. Now that sums up pretty much John Borman's Excalibur movie, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It has some great atmospheric acting within it, but it's something that never really chimed fully with me. You know, have chivalry, the Round Table, the knights, and Merlin. All the ingredients are there. That really chimes with the pagan spirituality, the pagan community, particularly if you have a more Celtic leaning, for example. But that led me to search even further into what was actually going on, and particularly, to go to Jean-Paul Sartre, famous French philosopher. He said that existence precedes essence. Now, that's sort of a fleeting way of saying that being is always becoming. There's always an evolution going on about our lives. We're never finished entities or beings. There's always more to come. We're self-creating. Yes. And that's what the hints I found within the tales of King Arthur is this great capacity for self-creation going through the traditional quest. If you look at the tarot, we start off as the fool and go through all those different lessons along our journey, ending with the world and perhaps ending on another level as the fool again as we go through this sort of cyclical journey, never truly finishing, always unfinished, but always growing, hopefully, and evolving. Now, with the Tales of King Arthur, there's many, and again, I'm going to try not to make this too historical. I want it to be more stream of consciousness, experiential, because I don't want to make it too dry. But the idea is that there were many different writers, and I will refer to some notes as well while I'm doing this. As I said, this is all about transformation, and with that is change and initiation. And if we think about the two sort of exemplars of the Western mystery tradition, what is magic if not change? Aleister Crowley, the great beast, said, "The science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will." And Dion Fortune said, "Magic is the art of causing changes to take place in consciousness in accordance with will." And that for me is what feels is at the core of the myths and legends and stories, songs, poems, TV shows and movies of King Arthur. It is somewhere within there is an initiatory process that can help transform our inner lives and thereby our outer lives as well. Because often the quest is to go within ourselves, but through doing so is often we access the deeper truths of the world around us as well, if that makes sense. So just to some historical facts around King Arthur in terms of literary sources. You would have heard of Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote in 1136 the history of the kings of Britain, and a lot of this was around him making sure he pleased his Norman rulers. And what he did was shift the figure of Arthur from the Dark Ages to that of the Middle Ages instead. And that's where it sort of really took on ideas of chivalry and knightliness. So all that epitomised in Robert Louis Stevenson and Ivanhoe, etc. The romance of the Arthurian tales started really sort of coming through, and he was sort of reinvented into this sort of emperor type. So something that perhaps could chime with those who were in power at the time. However, it was still very much the case that Arthur was never the one that did the heavy lifting. He was their manager, happy in his office, while his employees went out and faced the danger and brought back the stories, the news, etc. For that. Then around 40 years later, 1170-ish or so, there's Chrétien de Troyes, who's very much influenced by sort of the troubadour type. So sort of the romance was sort of ramping up, and he wrote 5 different romances. But what he brought in to it wasn't just the chivalry. He built on the chivalry and the knightliness, but also brought in sort of ideas of love, more emphasis on that, mystery and magic, which wasn't there so much beforehand with Geoffrey of Monmouth. And it was then also with the introduction of Lancelot and Guinevere. So it's starting to get a lot more EastEnders instead of Jon Snow's history documentaries. But he also introduced the idea of the Graal at this point, so that's something really important that we readily associate with King Arthur. It hadn't really appeared up until this point. However, it's Graal with a small g, as opposed to what we understand as the Graal, the Holy Grail being the cup, Last Supper, and captured the blood of the Christ figure in the Christian faith. But one standout character that, instead of Arthur, in de Troyes' stories, was a character called Percival. And Percival, he appears in the popular fiction stories like Excalibur, the movie, as well. And if memory serves, he was sort of almost like a little peasant boy in the movie who gets caught up in a battle and then gets sort of taken under the wing of Gawain, and he gradually becomes the knight. And again, his role is rather important, even in that movie as well. But he's basically a forest child in this, grows up in a glade with his mother. Again, from memory, there's something otherworld about his mother in many ways, and there are some linkages in terms of her being Fae, so from the land of Fairy in some way. But he's sort of besotted with this idea of being a knight, of the chivalric code, of going on adventures, rescuing princesses, fighting dragons, generally being a can-do kind of guy, hero all round, swishing and swigging the mead at the end of a hard day's brawling, with Morning Star and sword. But he's given some advice by his mother, in that to be a true knight, the only things you must accept or can accept are either a kiss or, at most, a ring. It's the idea of being altruistic or selfless. So that the sort of chivalric Judeo-Christian ethical code comes into play. So there's sort of the romance, but also a moral order to what a knight is or does, as well, which also follows through with the idea of the round table as well, in terms of no one sits above each other, in terms of equality of order, etc. But it's a sort of initiation process as well for Percival, in that everything he does throughout his journeys to begin with are done in an unthinking way. So if we put it in terms of a way we would perhaps understand it, there's a distinct lack of discrimination. So his airiness is rather unbalanced. He hasn't got his sword or fame well enough attuned to what he's doing, so nothing's really considered. So, for example, after rescuing a lady on the road, he forces a kiss upon her because his mother told him to, not thinking whether the lady would particularly welcome that or not. So that doesn't end too well. Then, as in nowadays. But one particular thing that's really interesting is the idea of the Fisher King, Percival. So he ends up at a castle one night, and there's a sort of a great feasting going on. Again, more swishing and swigging of mead. I've obviously got it on mind. I need to order some from Mr. Carrington. However, towards the end, all the swishing and swigging of mead and eating of mutton and munching of turnips, there's the doors swing open, and there's a magnificent procession that comes in, with people carrying what we call the Graal hallows. So it's a spear which is dripping with blood, a sword, a shield, and a chalice, all raised above. But again, Percival does this unquestioningly, like someone would watch TV, without really, letting it wash over him, instead of actually engaging with the world. He's sort of abstracted from it. So he falls asleep, as you do after a fair amount of mead. Wakes up, perhaps with a little bit of a wine cold, and the castle is completely empty. No one is around at all. He sort of scratches his head, wanders around, can't find anybody anywhere, and sort of goes outside, and in the courtyard there's a lady who's cradling a knight who's lying down with his head in her lap, as she sort of mops his brow, and she tells him, "This is the Fisher King." And if Percival had actually asked questions during a dinner about the procession of the Graal, what it meant, what it was, he may well have healed this king. And it's worth noting that there's often there's two characters that are often combined: the Fisher King, which is also a great movie with the great late Robin Williams, which is sort of a retelling of this in many ways, and King Arthur. Um, so the Wounded King, Fisher King, again is a character, figure, an archetype within myths and legends of Celtic mythology and through into others traditions as well. But importantly, that he's quite separate from that of King Arthur, but they were sort of conflated. And again, you can see that in the movie Excalibur as well, when it sort of goes a little bit surreal and trippy, when it's actually Percival who's going out all the knights. So Arthur's been wounded, the knights go out in search of the Graal, and as Arthur continues, asks, what is my name, and what is my relation to the land? And again, that's something that really I'd expect would chime with you as it does myself in terms of sovereignty and the earth and the relationship between a chief, a king, etc., and the land that they walk on and care for, hopefully, as well. However, he does quest onwards, and he does sort of learn his discrimination and to balance the four elements, the four Graal hallows within himself as well. But that's sort of the first point where you sort of, it's really within our modern understanding or interpretations of Arthur as well. But it wasn't until the 1200s with Robert de Baron that it really became the Graal, the cup, the chalice became the Holy Grail as we'd understand it. And that's when, so we've had the chivalric, knightly elements with bits of romance going through. Then that's developed further with a more myth and magic and love. And now with Robert de Baron in the 1200s, it's where we really get a more spiritual element to it as well, to the courtly love stories that were heretofore make up the sort of the canon. And that's when it sort of really sort of changed the face of Arthurian literature with this idea of the quest for the Holy Grail, bringing that religious and spiritual element to it. But again, it's not Arthur. It goes off and does the dirty work. It's still him sitting in the office, feet on the table, quaffing mead, while the knights go off and do all the dirty work. And in the 15th century, with Thomas Malory, with Mort d'Arthur, that we get the idea of the sword and the stone, the round tale, the more explicit use of Lancelot and Guinevere's betrayal, and that's what really sort of was the pinnacle and really sort of influenced the modern stories and understandings of King Arthur as well, whether it be White's Once and Future King, or again the different movies of King Arthur, Merlin, Excalibur, Marion Zimmer Bradley's Mists of Avalon, etc. Again, that's a really important, I say feminist retelling, but it was a sort of a rebalancing from the feminine point of view, away from the sort of more machismo elements of knights charging off while the fair folk stay at home. So again, that's well worth a read if you're so inclined as well. But there is another element to this as well, and that's why I want to move to Wales. Well, I quite like to move to Wales, but in terms of our story, because the Mabinogion in the 12th and 13th century may well have influenced sort of the writers like Cretin de Troyes, the Breton ballads, through sort of them travelling around Europe, and with the Welsh bards doing so as well. And again, that sort of oral tradition, the word of mouth, the spread of stories, was something that was quite sort of prominent in that time, spreading to the taverns, inns, boarding houses, and courts. And again, being given different flourishes by the different writers. But we have Arthur within that as well, in terms of a battle chief, particularly in the story of Culhwch and Owen. And I apologise for my Celtic pronunciation; it's terrible. But he's essentially Arthur's nephew, and she essentially gets kidnapped by a big nasty giant called Ipsodden. That's Olwyn, that is. And basically, he charges Culhwch with a series of tasks. So again, quests, and basically, Arthur sends his battle bands with Culhwch to sort of complete these different tasks, which he does, and wins the fair maiden, ending with the death of the giant Ipsodden after he's had his hair all shaved off. So again, a sort of a cutting of his virility and masculinity as well. But again, even in the Mabinogion, he's still sort of a do-nothing king. Frustratingly, it's still the knights. He's still sort of the manager, sending people out into the world. But there's another set of stories, or story, shall we say, in the Welsh tradition, and this is called the Spoils of Annwn. And in this you have a very, very different Arthur. So it's thought to be around 890 in terms of oral tradition, and then but only written down around about the 12th century in the Book of Taliesin. And here, instead of Arthur being a very passive character, he's very much so active, going on the quest with his knights, risking his life. So again, it's something very different. It's a poetical form. There's very little, extraneous bells and whistles in terms of romance, etc. It is sort of straightforwardly a chronicle of Arthur and his knights going into the depths of Annwn, or the Underworld, on a quest, going through, I'll say 7, but in truth 8 different lands with different forts, FORTS, that are each have their own characteristics. Not unlike, shall we say, if you're familiar with the Tree of Life and the Kabbalah, each of the Sephirot have different characteristics as well. So, for example, in terms of Yesod, in terms of moon and sexuality and the subconscious, and Teferet, Sephirot of the sun, of the sacrificed gods, for example. Each of these are experiential domains that are meant to unlock different elements within us, and hopefully do some sort of transformation on whatever level. But I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. So he descends into these lands, and there is a search for a magical cauldron within this, and again you start thinking, Graal, perhaps, but again cauldron sort of stems through a great deal of Celtic literature. So if we think of Gwion Bac and Ceridwen in terms of the cauldron that she sort of leaves him to watch as she's brewing a brew for her, so we say, more sort of idiot sort of son. So she brews this brew, 3 drops splash out onto his hand while he's watching it, and he quickly, as you do, with a burnt finger, put it to your mouth, and that's sort of 3 drops of inspiration that allow him sort of to become eventually the great bard Taliesin in the end, through sort of a goddess-given gifts, shall we say. So that sort of cauldron of rebirth. We have the Graal, which again is, if Indiana Jones is to believe, it's about giving immortality. But again, it's about transformation and change. And if we look at the idea of, so they travel in this ship, in this boat to these islands, and the boat is called Prydwen. But importantly, it also is seen within the literature as almost the body of the goddess. So then we have a link between the cauldron, the Graal, the chalice, and the womb. So in terms of rebirth and travelling in the body of the goddess, there's sort of really significant magical and spiritual elements to the story. And again, it's not just, I don't think I'm just seeing it through my eyes with my knowledge and experience of such things. They sort of just stand out on their own as they were. So what does this mean for us at this time? In many ways, each and every one of us is going through our own quest. And again, no one is sitting back, twiddling their thumbs and sending others out. It's everybody who's doing things for each other, for their families, for their communities, and also for the planet. I think there's so much sadness at the moment with everything that is going on, and it sort of seems painfully juxtaposed against the light outside sort of shining. But I hope that's sort of something that is the planet signalling hope in terms of getting through this with each other. And it's this sort of, again, our creative potential. We're seeing people thinking of new ways of speaking to their neighbours, of helping each other, looking to new, finding out about spiritualities via the internet in terms of using the time they've got. Hopefully finding more, speaking to their families and their friends in a more meaningful way instead of just passing the time when we're, in our day-to-day grind in terms of our lives. And I hope when we get through this, touch wood, that stays with us all. Perhaps there will be, however small, that kind of transformation within our own consciousness, and perhaps as the human race as well. Okay, thank you, and you take care all. Blessed be.